Hello there and welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Tom Pepper and today I'm going to be taking a look at someone I don't normally take a look at. It's Jim Sterling. So Jim Sterling is a fairly well known, I think, video game critic, journalist, etc. and is often getting themselves embroiled in controversies and that kind of thing. And that's what's happened here. I want to look at one of Jim Sterling's takes. One of the Jimquisition episodes to come out recently, reacting to some of the major news of the day. And one of the reasons I really wanted to do it is to show you that, arguments are everywhere and you need critical thinking to engage with any kind of material. Even something like that you wouldn't think is expressly about politics or social matters or arguing or critical thinking at all. You are going to need an argument to back up what you're saying. So let's take a look here what Jim Sterling was saying, what the topic is, and how we can analyze that from a critical thinking perspective. I'll reference the video here and leave a link down below, but the topic is that John Gibson, who was CEO of a company called Tripwire, put out a tweet in support of the new restrictive Texas abortion law. They lost their job shortly after that. They resigned, but it's fairly obvious they were forced out of their job. And then Jim Sterling put out his take on the Jimquisition. So in this video, I'm going to do a quick background on Jim Sterling, if you don't know who he is, then a quick background on the topic. Then I'm going to break down the argument Jim Sterling provides. I'm going to show you what went wrong with it and how I would go about fixing it, or at least what solutions there are to the problems. I think the main thing I want to focus on here is what we call the Paradox of Liberalism, because I think that Jim Sterling is a really great example of that particular problem. So let's dive right in. One thing I do have to get out of the way right at the beginning when talking about Jim Sterling is that Jim Sterling currently goes by many names, and I'm generally not trying to be cute about this or anything. I'm not sure how Jim Sterling likes to be referred to, but as the name of the credits still says Jim Sterling and the channel name is Jim Sterling, I'm going to say Jim Sterling. I believe Jim Sterling prefers they, them pronouns. I might slip up and call them a he. I really am sorry if I offend anybody with this, but it genuinely is confusing with Jim Sterling. Like, I really am not sure what's a joke and what they really care about being addressed as. So I am sorry if that upsets anybody. But mainly Jim Sterling is a video game critic. They do less critiquing now than they used to, which I think is a shame. I think Jim Sterling is a really funny presenter with a lot of good comic ideas. Jim Sterling focuses more now on the sort of business journalism side of stuff. And I think that's really important. I don't know anyone else doing that, at least on the level Jim Sterling does, just calling out the video games industry for all its BS and terrible work practices. I think that is a really useful job. And one of the reasons I liked watching Jim Sterling's stuff was that I always thought he argued really well. Would always just present a clear conclusion, here's the thing I want you to believe, and then show how you would get there. One of the problems I think that's happened over the years is that kind of builds up, and Jim Sterling thinks if you're watching his shows, you'll be in sort of the same mindset, which means he doesn't always establish his premises enough as he should and kind of assumes you're in the same kind of headspace, which leads to some really, really sloppy arguing. And obviously some very bad takes, and I think this take was a really bad one. So as I said, the CEO, John Gibson, they supported the new abortion laws in Texas in this tweet, which we'll look at now. Shortly after that tweet, Gibson had been forced out of the company. Fairly obviously, the company had said they don't want to work with him and would not work with him. Some businesses had ended their links with Tripwire altogether over that one single tweet. And then to add to his woes, Jim Sterling weighed in with this take. So I'll break down exactly what was wrong with Jim Sterling's argument in a sec. But one thing I do want to call attention to is this paradox of liberalism. If you're not aware, we'll go through it all. Liberalism would be the sort of political, social methodology system that says that people should be treated as free, rational individuals that can make their own choices. As a result of that, when they do make their own choices, you should be respectful of that, right? Now, one problem that's always been hanging around the philosophy of liberalism is the tolerance issue. Should you tolerate bigots and Nazis and people that don't tolerate you and people who would happily line you up against the wall and shoot you if they had the chance? It's sort of an ethical, abstract problem. We're committed to tolerance. So does that mean we tolerate these intolerant people, or we shouldn't tolerate these tolerant people? But it's also a practical problem, right? What do you do if you choose to tolerate these really intolerant people? Are they going to cause practical problems for people in your society in the future? Will they even make it an intolerant society, which is just what you're trying to avoid? One solution to this, which plenty of people on the social left are taking, and I think I get the impression Jim Sterling is taking too, is absolutely not. You do not tolerate those people. they sort of opt out of liberalism in a way by like being so intolerant. They don't show respect for the values of tolerance, and so they shouldn't get any tolerance. And we'll go through some specific quotes here where Jim Sterling makes it clear this person is getting no tolerance and no mercy, and that they absolutely should have been fired. I'm going to show why Jim Sterling doesn't really establish that in this video, my video. And I'm also going to provide some reasons for thinking that the opposite is true. Like, not only should this person not have been, I mean, they were effectively fired, so I'm going to say they were fired in the video. Not only should this person not have been fired, but they shouldn't have been able to be fired. Like, the company should now be in trouble for John Gibson leaving, since it's so obvious they were forced out. This kind of thing should not be allowed to happen in social liberalism. But let's look at what Jim Sterling said first. I want to make clear that in this video, I do realize Jim Sterling stuff is like mostly comedic. I mean, it's obvious that this was quite a serious video for them, but like I'm not going to nitpick over every little bit of hyperbole, but there are two instances of hyperbole that were so hyperbolic that I feel they need mentioning. So Jim Sterling says at one point that John Gibson believes women deserve no agency and is fully in favor of totalitarian government rule, right? So this is what I was saying before about how Jim Sterling kind of assumes if you're watching the video, you're in the same headspace as them. Like obviously John Gibson doesn't think women deserve no agency at all. This is one question about abortion, which is something else I want to get out of the way early. Jim Sterling doesn't make this video about arguing for abortion. Like, as far as Jim Sterling is concerned, like, that's already been done. Abortion is a good thing, as Jim Sterling literally says in this video, just a blanket good thing. So I'm not going to argue that. This isn't a video arguing for or against abortion or anything. This is all about John Gibson losing their job. But on to the hyperbole point, Sterling does later say that John Gibson is evil and says that Jim Sterling, has no sympathy for evil. So that's kind of where we're coming from. So when I detail the rest of this argument, if it sounds really threadbare to you, you've got to remember that's like the underlying premise of it all, is like John Gibson hates women and is sexist and is awful and is a Nazi and is the worst person in the world, right? So that's what's feeding into Jim Sterling's argument. Of course, he puts no effort into the video in establishing that. He just assumes you'll agree with that premise. But unfortunately, the rest of the argument doesn't work at all if you don't think that John Gibson is the worst person to have ever lived. So I just want to cover that, because that hyperbole does play an important part in the argument. It's not just a jokey thing. The next thing I wanted to get out of the way is this hypocrisy argument. Jim Sterling calls John Gibson a hypocrite because John Gibson is apparently, in other areas, quite libertarian, like on guns. John Gibson doesn't think the state should get involved in your guns. So Jim Sterling says, well, that makes him a hypocrite. Now, the hypocrisy charge is a really popular one, partly because it shows someone has to be wrong about something. If you're a hypocrite, it means two of your beliefs contradict, or that your beliefs contradict your actions in some way. So something must be wrong. And obviously no one ever likes admitting that anything is wrong. So if you can corner someone into being a hypocrite, that's a really good job. Unfortunately, this accusation doesn't really work because it isn't well fleshed out. Like, everyone in the world believes that the government should stop you doing some things, like murder, and not stop you doing other things, like going to the shops. That's not hypocrisy to think that the government should do one thing and not the other. I mean, John Gibson presumably has his own reasons for thinking the government should stop abortions and not stop gun ownership. They might be independently terrible, but like on the face of it, that's no reason to call Gibson a hypocrite. You see this a lot from both sides now with the like vaccination and abortion stuff. Like a lot of sort of anti-Republican people are saying, oh, Republicans are such hypocrites. They say the government should, not force you to get a vaccination, but should force you to get an abortion. It's like, well, you think the other way around, presumably, so aren't you a hypocrite too? Which is the shoes on the other foot. Point being, none of these people are actual hypocrites unless their reasoning is simply, I think the government should make decisions for you, and then sometimes they slip from that. But otherwise, everyone that isn't a total authoritarian or a total anarchist is going to be a hypocrite in some sense. So I don't think there's any real hypocrisy there, no real dangerous contradiction there, really on either side. But where there is a weird contradiction is in Sterling's own video. I'm going to read out some quotes here because I want to nail down exactly what they said. So Sterling claims that Gibson and sort of that group, I assume sort of right-wing, like American Christians, are by far the nation's most pandered to demographic. And the world does nothing but coddle them and their fifis. Again, this is a video Jim Sterling was making about how the man lost his job. It's really weird. To at one point, and Sterling also says something about, everyone on Twitter had to go at him for this. It's like, so how how are their views protected? How are they mollycoddled? The guy lost his job for, a fairly anodyne. It wasn't like he slagged off people who had abortions or said, oh, if you have abortion, you're a terrible person. He just expressed support for, a law. And in the same video, Sterling later says the game industry is rotten to the core and run by wankers. It's like, but everything happened exactly like he wanted it to. I mean, he wanted John Gibson to lose his job for this. So the world seems to be operating more according to Sterling's wishes than Gibson's, because Gibson presumably would have liked to keep his job. So yeah, I don't know if I call that hypocrisy, but that's a definite contradiction in what Sterling is saying, right? Like those two things, people like Gibson being mollycoddled and Gibson losing his job for expressing his views, they can't both be true. Sterling, like I said, isn't that bad at arguing and does at least anticipate one of the responses here, which will be that John Gibson had freedom of speech and shouldn't suffer negative consequences for this tweet. Sterling's response to this is really interesting and definitely hypocritical. So I'm going to read it again. So I figured what Sterling would probably say was something like, Gibson is free to speak, but Tripwire was free to get rid of him, or like force him out, or they didn't really fire him at all. Oddly, Sterling does say, well, Gibson was free to speak, but then backs that up with, Tripwire is free to protect its standing in the games industry, which is such a weird pro-corporatist position for Sterling to take. And that kind of supports what I was saying in the beginning about Sterling being one of these liberals who has just gone the intolerant route and will now just support any means to punish people that aren't living up to the liberal standard, that aren't themselves being super tolerant and open all the time. At least Jim Sterling, this person whose entire sort of channel and existence is against like corporate profitability and boardroom directors doing what they want and trampling over individuals. Sterling is suddenly now like, well, they're free to protect their standing in the game industry. There's profit to be had. It's so strange. Like, I get, given the circumstances and given the fact that everyone turned against John Gibson, that Gibson was becoming unprofitable for Tripwire. I get that. I just think even so, the company should not have the right to fire that person or get rid of them. I think it should be a tribunal issue. So particularly weird for Sterling to take that stance, which seems to go against everything else he believes. We get a few more really weak points made very quickly here. Sterling says something about how he wasn't fired for wrongthink. Again, I thought he was going to say, well, it's wrong speech. That's very different. But instead, Sterling just says, like, it was deliberate. It wasn't like a mistake. So it's okay, I guess. Then he trots out the famous, freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences line. It is. Like, if you're saying something gets you into trouble, like with your business or with your government, you weren't free to say that thing, right? I'm tired of this whole, oh, you're completely free to say whatever you like. We'll just throw you in jail if we don't like. Like, no. Freedom of speech really, really is freedom from consequences. So go check out my Gina, what was her name? The one from Mandalorian, Gina Carano. Go check out my videos on her, and I debunked that there. And some noises are made as well about like Gibson being a CEO. I think that's how Sterling is trying to justify this in their mind by being like, oh, well, it's not like a regular working Joe got fired for anything. This is John Gibson. They were a CEO anyway. Something bad happens to a rich and powerful CEO. That's basically a good thing. My response to that would be that if the CEO can't get away with it, who can, right? Like, Gibson can I don't think Gibson's been making a fuss, but Gibson could make a fuss online, is going to get a lot of media attention, right? If you work in that company and you support the abortion law, are you going to feel free, tweeting out just, I support this law like John Gibson did? Of course you're not. CEO can't get away with it. Nobody can. So any threat to one worker, even if they're a CEO, is a threat to all the other workers because it will become normalized over time. Now I'm going to break Jim Sterling's argument down into premises and conclusions to see how it works. I'm going to go through a couple of proposed arguments that Sterling puts out in the video, and then also what I think is the real argument sort of running through the video, and I'll show you why they don't work. So this is one formulation of the argument Sterling is putting forward here. So the conclusion he's driving to is always going to be it's a good thing, or at least it's acceptable, that John Gibson lost his job, right? That is what Sterling is trying to convince you of using logic and rationality. So here we start off with premise one, the abortion ban is harmful, which is something that Jim Sterling outright says is a premise there. Well, you can call this a dodgy premise. Like, you could argue against it as it is, but practically, I think it's obvious there are going to be some major complications in Texas. So I think that's a good enough premise. We can say that premise is sound. That premise is basically true. The abortion ban is harmful. At the very least, we can be charitable and give it to Sterling. Premise 2 then is advocating for the abortion ban means more things like that might happen in other states, or Texas might get more restrictive. And let's give that. I mean, advocating in general will make this kind of law more likely. I really doubt that just on a small scale, like that one particular text made it any more likely that an abortion ban was going to happen. But okay, in general, sure, we can give that premise too. Premise 3 then has to be Gibson going means there'll be less advocacy, which, as I said before, I think is probably true. I think people are going to support abortion restrictions less if they're worried about losing their jobs. So we do have to asterisk that by saying, like, well, yes, because people will be scared to express their opinions. And then premise 4 underlying it is the sort of big philosophical one that Sterling has no time to get into, which is utilitarianism, right? Because if you don't follow a utilitarian theory of ethics, then like causing harm might not even be the kind of thing that is going to bother you, weird as that may sound. This, I would say, is the best formulation of the argument because you need to go to the deepest level to show why it's wrong. I would say, like I said, the first three premises are all kind of dodgy. Like, you can argue against them if you want, and that's why the argument is not airtight by any means. But the utilitarianism thing is the real problem here. It's not all about weighing up the harms done and weighing up the positives done and rack them against each other and finding out mathematically whether an act was a good one or not. I don't think that's a good way of doing ethics, and I don't have time for it in this video. So the argument could fail on those terms if you just don't accept the truth of utilitarianism, which, it's a fact most people don't. I expect most people don't know what the hell it is. So most people wouldn't agree with the philosophy of utilitarianism. And then each premise is slightly dodgy in its own way, especially because, and it's one of the problems with utilitarianism, it's very hard to say how much good and how much bad will come out of any particular action. I mean, maybe Gibson, maybe this is the last straw for Gibson and he goes postal and there's some really terrible, horrible stuff now because this happened and it's much worse than it would have been otherwise, right? It's impossible to tell. But that there is the best formulation of the argument, and it's all there. Sterling does, even though it's a short video, does present premises leading to a conclusion, so well done. Different kind of formulation here. So this would be something like, I'm going to use the term prick, because I think it's the term Jim Sterling uses. So Gibson supporting the abortion ban proves he's a prick, is premise 1. Premise 2, pricks act like pricks in numerous ways. And this might seem like a weird premise, but what I mean is a prick won't just support an abortion ban, right? To Jim Sterling, in his mind. A prick will also be horrible in all kinds of other ways. It's like the idea, if you know someone's really bad, like if they're a liar, you assume they might also be uncharitable. Or if they're really uncharitable, you might assume that, I don't know, they're horrible to their wife or whatever, right? It's that idea, well, I know they got one bad thing about them, so there's probably other bad things about them too. And then premise 3 would be some sort of like justificatory thing, like pricks deserve to be fired. This argument, again, looks valid, like the structure is fine, but it's the soundness is the problem. Like, these premises, you might just not think they're true. You might not think that him supporting the ban proves he's a prick. You might think, well, okay, it proves I don't like being pro-anti-abortion, if that makes sense. You might think, okay, he's got this one really bad mark about him, but we don't know he's horrible in any other kind of way. And then you might not agree with the third premise at all, and you might think, well, okay, so he's a dickhead. Why does that mean he should lose his job any more than he should go to jail or have his kneecaps broken by Tony Soprano, So again, those are the two main arguments presented, and the problem with most of them is they're just really shaky premises that Sterling thinks you'll agree with on sort of an emotional level, but makes no effort to actually, establish in the video. And here's the argument that I think is actually going on in Jim Sterling's head when he talks about these kind of things. Premise 1, I don't like John Gibson, he's an evil prick. Premise 2, losing his job made me, Jim Sterling, happy. Premise 3, things that make me happy are good. Obviously, I'm not going to go through why that argument is bad, it's just purely emotional based, but I suspect that's what is actually happening. I suspect Jim Sterling isn't thinking too much about utilitarianism. I think Jim Sterling saw John Gibson do something annoying, then got fired, and Jim Sterling was happy about that, so it must have been the right thing to do, right? So what are the fixes, and how can we avoid the kind of sloppy thinking that Jim Sterling displayed in this video? Well, one way is to think abstractly. Like, Jim Sterling knows abstractly he doesn't want to take power away from employees, even CEOs, and give it to people higher up the food chain. Like, Jim Sterling knows that's bad. The only reason they supported it in this case was because they didn't like John Gibson, and that's it. It's so non-abstract. It's just, if this had been a person that Jim Sterling knew personally and liked, it might have played out differently again. And it's like, you can't base sort of social rules just on a whim and who you like and who you don't like, which of course is a massive problem with cancel culture. There are no solid rules, and there should be, and they should be enforced by some sort of fairness in hiring and firing agency, which would be my solution for businesses in the wider world too. Don't fire people for their opinions, even if they express them. I know there was one company that worked with Tripwire that just like put out a strongly worded, solemn JPEG type thing saying we do not agree, and that's fine. That is them exercising their freedom of speech. I mean, I think the sort of company spoke for the workers when they said our company does not respect those values. It's like, well, there's no one in your company think it, but whatever. That's all fine, but otherwise I would say it should be a legal matter. Like the company that broke off its engagement with Tripwire, they shouldn't be allowed to do that on the back of one guy tweeting, even if it caused obvious economic harm, right? That's just the cost of freedom of speech. If it's happening for anti-abortion people now, it could be happening to socialists in the future, because all you need to say is, well, socialists are like communists, and communists, they killed a lot of people, so we really need to nip this in the bud. Or, Muslims, maybe some of their attitudes might be considered sexist. What if they tweet about that? What if they lose their jobs, essentially, because of their religion? The very thing liberalism was initially set up really to counter, sort of to deal with people's religious differences. That paradox of liberalism always returns, right? You don't want to enter a purity spiral like the social left is doing, where you get more and more intolerant of everyone who doesn't agree with everything that you agree with until there's just nobody left. But thank you very much for watching and listening. Please leave a like if you liked the video, share it with anyone you think might like it. Leave a comment down below, anything you'd like to agree with or challenge me on or disagree with. It'd be great to hear from you. And tune in next time. I'll probably be doing the introduction to British politics stuff next. We just had conference seasons. That's a hot topic over here. Until then, I've been Dr. Tom Pepper, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.